Give yourselves a massive round of applause for coming here today. We're absolutely delighted. People from Northern Ireland might know me. I'm quite well known comedian and actor and stuff here. But today we're discussing Northern Ireland's humanist heritage, and I have an abiding interest in Irish history. I'm a big fan of Irish history. I love my history. There's a great Ulster historian, A.T.Q. Stewart, who said about Irish history, he said, "No Irishman knowingly understates a grievance." And the great poet W.B. Yeats said, being Irish, he had an abiding sense of tragedy, which sustained him through temporary periods of joy. And we have an Irish history that is scattered with blood and dissension and war and this, that, and the other. And as a radical, as an atheist, I have to say I'd have to lay the blame firmly at the door of St. Patrick. This country was a pagan country before that bugger arrived and screwed everything up. We were happy, we were worshipping stones, we were doing this, that, and the other. We were having a ball. And then he feckin' turned up and ruined it for everybody. And thanks to St. Patrick, we then got Oliver Cromwell, civil war, religious dissension, the Troubles, and Ian Paisley Jr. Religion poisons everything, ladies and gentlemen. Irish history is basically, you know, the last few hundred years, Irish history is basically the failure of the Protestant Reformation to conquer Ireland. But then in the 1840s, where basically the notion of Protestantism and unionism became allied, and Catholicism and nationalism became allied. But we want to talk about slightly more than that, because we want to talk about dissenting voices, people who are not religious, people who are gone beyond religion, and the other voices. And there were little movements throughout Irish history. In the 1790s, there was a radical movement started here in Belfast, the United Irishmen, who took their inspiration from the French Revolution and Thomas Paine and things like that, and they became a radical Republican movement. There was another Republican movement in the 1850s called the Fenian movement, who were a radical Republican movement, wanted to drive the British out of Ireland, but interestingly had a program that was, they wanted an entirely secular Irish republic. They wanted nothing to do with the church, the church to have no control over this new republic, and they were therefore surprisingly despised by the Catholic Church. What we're going to talk about today is those dissenting voices, those other radical voices, because the history of Ireland isn't necessarily, we always see it as very binary, and we always see it as Protestants and Catholics. And, you know, I'll be honest with you, sectarianism is an absolute blight on this society. It has destroyed the society, it has held society back. On the plus side, I've made quite a good career out of it. So like swings and roundabouts, you know what I'm saying? But there have been other voices. Other dissenting voices in the history of Ireland. And I don't like to take issue with my friends in Humanist UK, but in the programme it says that they're going to look at the history of secularism in Northern Ireland over the last few hundred years. And you go, hold on a minute, lads. Northern Ireland's only been here for 101 years. Now, for us, that isn't history. For us, that's the day before yesterday. But we have two expert speakers who are going to talk to you today, and then we're going to throw it up into the floor. We're going to have a chat about this, that, and the other. Feel free to join in at the end. We're going to have two excellent speakers. We have, first of all, Madeleine Goodall, who's the Humanist Heritage Coordinator at Humanist UK. Since 2019, she's been researching our 126-year history, as well as exploring the wider presence and influence of humanists and the non-religious in the UK. She's a background in education, museums, and community history, and is also Humanist UK's Wikimedian in residence. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Madeleine Goodall.
Thank you. Tim gave a great introduction, actually, so I don't have to kind of apologise for lacking the enormous sweep that he's kind of just covered a little bit there. But one of the things that was mentioned during the dialogue event that took place yesterday afternoon was that often those minority voices, those voices that are not of the Catholic or the Protestant tradition, are forgotten, not just in Northern Ireland, but in the wider UK. So I think a better understanding of the history can be part of the corrective, to recognising that there has always been a presence, a non-religious presence, here in the northern part of Ireland, and indeed in the wider UK in general, which has of course been the focus of the Humanist Heritage Project. Hopefully people are aware of the Humanist Heritage Project. As Tim said, it's been going since 2019, looking at researching the 125-year, now 126-year history of Humanists UK, and that much longer tradition. But while I was tempted to try and do an enormous sweep, I am going to stick largely to a couple of, I guess, kind of key precursors to the present day movement in Northern Ireland. And for that, I would like to focus on first the Belfast Ethical Society, who are particularly interesting, I would argue, and then later the humanist movement, the organised humanist movement, the Belfast Humanist Group in the 60s. So I will start, there we go, by mentioning, as I say, the Belfast Ethical Society. The ethical societies were emerged in the 1880s in the UK, groups bringing together people who believed that it was possible to live moral lives without believing in supernatural ideas, or indeed without agreeing on ideas of the supernatural, or on the afterlife, or on punishment and reward by anything external to the earth. And it was the Union of Ethical Societies, formed in 1896, which was the origin of Humanists UK today. So those ethical societies and the ethical movement that they were part of was the beginning of this tradition that we are very much part of today. It's important to note that the ethical societies in their origins did not require a disavowal of religion. You did not have to say you were atheist or even necessarily agnostic to be part of an ethical society, which is one of the things that makes the Belfast Society quite interesting, because we know that the two kind of leaders of the Belfast group did consider themselves to be very much rationalist, agnostic, non-religious. And again, this is a challenge to this idea that there is somehow this newfangled thing called humanism in Northern Ireland that hasn't had a history before. I've got here an example of an advert for an early talk by the Belfast Ethical Society, or for the Belfast Ethical Society, which had been formed in 1896, so the same year as Humanists UK itself. And this features a lecture by Stanton Coit, whose name you might have heard. He was actually an American, but very important in propelling the organised ethical movement over here. And I really show this because you can see, kind of encapsulated in the quotes they've chosen, the focus or the beliefs of the ethical societies at the time. So they've quoted Kant, "The death of dogma is the birth of morality." They've quoted Emerson, "The moral sentiment is alone omnipotent." And then at the bottom, they've quoted Huxley as well, T.H. Huxley. "Do what you can do to do what you ought, and leave hoping and fearing alone." T.H. Huxley famously coined the term agnostic in 1869, so a few decades before we're talking about here. But you can see the influences that the society are drawing on. And this meeting house that's pictured next to them was where they were meeting. Apologies to those of you who were on the walking tour yesterday, because we would have walked past or down Rosemary Street, which is where this was. Today, the first Presbyterian church still exists, but the second was demolished in the 1960s. So this is just an illustration of the meeting place of the Belfast Ethical Society. The Ethical Society held weekly meetings. They debated all sorts of things, had lectures on all sorts of things, including rationalism, science, evolution. But very interestingly, again, with the Belfast group, they emerged very much out of the socialist movement. And both the leaders, William Knox and J.H. Gilliland, were both very active in the wider socialist movement and the cooperative movement as well. So at the same time as they were disavowing religion, they were very much acting on the morals that they believed were still possible without religion. James Heron Gilliland, I tragically do not have a picture of, but I've taken a couple of snips from his various censuses, because we're lucky in the Irish census that we can see at this stage how they identified in terms of their religion. On the left, hopefully you can see in 1901, James Heron Gilliland, as was his name, identified himself first as a rationalist, later as an agnostic. So as I say, unusually, we know that was how he self-defined. Gilliland was a distiller's clerk, so he was a working man, and he was also the organiser of Belfast's Cinderella Club, which was part of the wider socialist movement, which worked to provide food and entertainment for impoverished children. And I mentioned some of his charitable efforts because you'll see that later on, and as to a certain extent we still suffer today, there is sometimes this idea that atheists, agnostics, non-religious people have not contributed anything to wider society, which of course we know to be completely wrong. His companion in the ethical societies was a gentleman called William Mayne Knox, who was described by a friend of his at the time, another Irishman, as a one-eyed propagandist of atheism and socialism. I don't know what the one-eyed refers to because I'm not sure whether he was indeed partially sighted or indeed had only one eye. It doesn't look like it from this image, but perhaps he was laser-focused on atheism and socialism as twin aims. Both men regularly lectured for the ethical societies, and they were also interested, as I say, more widely in things like the cultural scene of Belfast at the time. So they were interested in literature, as well as in some other radical societies. Knox, for example, was also secretary of the National Secular Society's Ulster branch, which had kind of emerged in the 1870s and at different points after that. And also the Belfast Radical Association, among the aims of which was the disestablishment of the church. And he was also actively involved in the Belfast Debating Society, the Belfast and District Workers' Educational Association, and was at various times president and secretary of the Belfast Cooperative Society. And again, these interests, these varied interests, political and cultural and charitable, were quite common for those within the ethical movement, as they were then describing it at the time. And this wider tie-in with social reform, with education, continues to be the case with later incarnations of humanist activism. Although the ethical society itself came to an end in 1913, there were clearly still pockets of organised rationalism, atheism, happening in Belfast and around the northern part of Ireland. Enough so that in 1931, the literary guide, as it was then, now the New Humanist, could claim that it is common knowledge that, without exaggeration, practically half the population are rationalists at heart. And they called on their Belfast members, so the Rationalist Press Association, to realise this latent force, to draw together these freethinkers, these humanists in activism together. And there were also later mentions of, for example, in Larne, the formation of other ethical societies. But I want to move now to leap forward, as it were, to the emergence once again of organised humanism by that name in Belfast during the 1960s. And this was with the Belfast Humanist group. Pictured on this slide is John D. Stewart, who was an engineer, a playwright, Belfast-born, largely forgotten, doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, and Tim did mention that I am the Wikimedian in residence of Humanists UK, so I am out to correct that. But John D. Stewart, by and large, seems to have been quite forgotten, but he really was one of the voices for organised humanism in Belfast during the 1960s. And he wrote himself that he had probably always been a humanist, and he really saw it as a means of creating more tolerance within Irish society, and of finding common ground, which was very much the interest of the wider humanist movement during the 1960s and into the 70s and beyond, of course, as we know. But this beginning of more vocally humanist presence in Belfast did not go unnoticed in the local press, the Belfast press, or by religious figures who did see challenges and accusations that religion might be the cause of some of the things that were dividing people, that they wanted to point out that actually atheism had never contributed anything. For example, Canon Noble Hamilton, commenting on a lecture that John D. Stewart had given to the Belfast Humanist group, said, "The contribution humanism has given life is not exactly an impressive one. I would remind Mr. Stewart that, were the history of the 20th century reviewed, the contribution atheistic thought has given to civilization would make pretty sordid reading." I should point out once again that this has been one of the things that we have been actively fighting, this notion, with the Humanist Heritage Project. And we've got innumerable examples of how wrong this is. But Stewart had supposedly, in this talk he gave in 1966 to the Belfast group, described the churches as the greatest mischief makers on the face of the earth. Which is actually, mischief makers is quite sweet sounding, really, quite generous maybe. But as I say, John D. Stewart was a prominent voice, and I think he probably didn't always make friends in the sense that he did have a very hardline, fairly anti-religious approach, which was not generally the stance taken by the Belfast Humanist group. You can see in this report of the group from 1967 the description that the Belfast Humanist group is one of the strongest in the United Kingdom per head of the population and is still growing. You can see the echoes of this as we talk about Northern Ireland humanists today. Its aims are to encourage a rational, responsible and humanitarian approach to life and a reliance on man's own intellectual, moral and social resources in every aspect of Northern Ireland life, to promote a knowledge of the psychological and social foundations of morality, as an essential factor for the establishment of a harmonious community in Northern Ireland, to give practical service to the community. Mr. Potter said, "Today, we don't want to interfere with anyone else's beliefs, but we get a little bit upset when our own personal freedoms are interfered with." A little bit upset. He and other members spoke about not being able to use swimming baths. This was one of the campaigns they took up. Children's swings, or visit art galleries, or many of the other public places that are closed on Sundays. And mentions, of course, the group is opposed to compulsory religious education in schools. This report from 1967, in fact, comes from the same year as the formation of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, of which John D. Stewart was one of the founding figures. And I'd just like to briefly mention here, while I can, that in fact humanists were behind the formation of the major civil rights organisations in Northern Ireland, England, and the Republic of Ireland. So Ronald Kidd and Sylvia Scaffardi behind the Association for Civil Liberties in England, and Owen Sheehy Skeffington behind the early incarnation of the Civil Rights Association in Ireland. So we've got a proud legacy there in terms of humanist activism for civil rights, as we might expect, of course. And they celebrated very strongly in 1968 the International Day of Human Rights. This led to, or in part, to the first joint conference of humanists in Ireland, which took place in 1969 and brought together the Dublin-based Irish Humanist Association and the Belfast Humanist Group. And key participants in this included, I've mentioned him already, Owen Sheehy Skeffington, the physicist and founder of the British Conservation Society, Douglas McEwen, political philosopher Alan Milne, John D. Stewart, of course, pictured here, I should say, and co-founder of the British and Irish anti-apartheid movements, Kader Asmal, as well as Secretary of the Irish Humanist Association, Antonia Healy. And that conference resolved to strive for the achievement of peace, justice and tolerance in Ireland, and held that outmoded attitudes and traditions which interfere with this achievement should be superseded by more valuable ideas and actions. They were careful, and participants at the conference were careful, not to suggest that what they were saying was that everybody should be a humanist, was that everything would be better if every person agreed on everything. What they were much more closely aligned with was the concept of the open society, which was very much the foundation for lots of the British Humanist Association's policy from the 1970s onwards, which was a focus on pluralism, on tolerance, on respect, on dialogue, on finding common ground, much as we still do today, and as I mentioned at the beginning, that the Northern Ireland Interfaith Forum do very well. And the conference took as its immediate task work for the repeal of all legislation which impedes the development of a fully democratic society. And they argued that not only did humanists have a kind of duty to help in this, but they also really wanted to emphasise that humanists had a right to, that the non-religious had a right to have a voice in these things, and that they should be heard. They shouldn't be dismissed out of hand based on the idea that they'd somehow done away with all the basis of good morality. And so I just want to end, I suppose, with a quote from a letter that was written to a Belfast newspaper in 1964 from somebody in County Down who signed off as humanist, who was worried that the conclusion of various other letters written in by religious people to the newspaper would be that to cast aside the church, religion, or the example of Christ would be to cast aside the ethical and moral values on which civilization has been based, and in fact, a good life has become impossible for them. This both exasperates and grieves me, this letter writer wrote, for I am a humanist. Morals, in fact, have nothing, I believe, to do with belief in the supernatural, and my reason for wanting a truly moral society is because I accept my position as a human being, of this world, committed to this world, affirming life in it. These people who have stepped away from religion, abandoned religious beliefs, have arrived at their position after considerable intellectual exertion, and most are, like me, passionately driven to improve man's rights and freedoms. What can they do in the insular, prejudiced atmosphere here? Are they to be written off in the interests of not rocking the boat? Or will they be given the freedom to help tackle the problems facing the world, to the solution of which the churches have offered more opposition and indifference than leadership? And hopefully some of those questions posed by said humanist will be addressed in this next presentation and in our general discussion. Forgot to show you all of the great things they said. These are just a collection of the headlines which were written about some of the things that these humanists in the 60s and 70s took up. This first one refers to a lecture that John D. Stewart gave in 1967 under the title, Let's Humanise Ulster. That was the humanists airing their views in public. I particularly like Humanists Have Hearts to Bequeath, which was about encouraging members to donate their organs, basically, to carry some kind of card which said that they would donate their organs. And you've heard a bit about them trying to open things up on Sundays, which included having children defy Sunday swing ban, bringing their children along to swing on a Sunday doesn't sound great, but to use the swings on a Sunday. And you can see that they were also touching on lots of those other issues that were so prevalent during the 60s and 70s, and unfortunately are still prevalent now. So abortion, let women make the decision. Ulster divorce reform pressure. And I quite like the simple, humanists do object. That could refer to many things. But I will properly leave. I'll do a second leaving now. And just invite you all, if you haven't already, to look at the Humanist Heritage website and to check out a self-guided walking tour you can do through the walking app Go Jauntly, which we put together, which puts some of this wider history in a geographical context as well. So if you've got time while you're in beautiful Belfast, then please do check it out. But now I will go. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. Really appreciate that. Very, very interesting. I didn't know much about the Belfast Ethical Society. Interesting as well about socialism and its influence on humanism. You probably know Mick Lynch. You've probably heard of Mick, haven't you? Everybody's heard of Mick. Was on, and he said that one of his political heroes was a big guy by the name of James Connolly, the radical socialist who ended up in the 1916 Easter Rising. But James Connolly was a socialist and an atheist, except that he converted on his deathbed to become a Catholic for a lot of reasons that I won't go into. But James Connolly tried to come up here and foment strikes among the workers, tried to unite the workers, but every single time they were held back by the sectarianism of the workers, and the trump card always was religion. Somebody once said that the worst year in Irish history was 1795, when the British government allowed the Catholic Church to educate their priests in Maynooth, and the same year the foundation of the Orange Order. And both organisations, he said, have been supported. Some people say that the British deliberately created those organisations to divide us. I'm not sure if that's true. Orange Order, you know, I have some friends in the Orange Order. Strange organisation. Apparently, if you're in the Orange Order, you're genuinely forbidden to go to a Catholic Mass. You're forbidden to go to Mass. And many Catholics think of that and go, the jammy bastards. It is true, ladies. On a slightly personal note, it's interesting that those organisations were there, but they were small organisations. And from my personal view, I was recruited by Boyd Sleater. It sounds more sinister than it was, by the way, to join the Northern Ireland Humanists. But even 5 or 10 years ago, I was quite nervous about coming out and saying, I am a humanist, I am an atheist. Because, you know, this is still a very religious society. Religion plays a very, very important part. And, you know, I have my principles, but I also have tickets to sell. But I'm very glad I did. I think this movement is changing. It's becoming far more radical. It's becoming the middle ground and the atheist ground and the secular. We're becoming a far more secular society. But we're still hampered by the prospect of sectarianism. We're going to hand over now to Dr. Charlie Lynch, who's a cultural and a social historian whose research interests span both sides of the Irish Sea. He's a co-author of a forthcoming intellectual and institutional history, the humanist movement in Britain, and is at present research associate in history at Ulster University, pursuing a project entitled Queer Northern Ireland Before Liberation. He's going to talk to us particularly about one self-identified humanist, H. Montgomery Hyde, a very interesting person, barrister, politician and author, and a very, very influential person. And could you please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Charlie Lynch.
Now, you may well ask, who was Harford or H. Montgomery Hyde? So Harford Montgomery Hyde has been summed up by his biographer as an Ulster Unionist MP, a gay law reform campaigner, and a prodigious author. So these qualities may seem at first unlikely and even contradictory. For most of the 20th century, the Ulster Unionist Party represented Northern Ireland's political establishment and presided over an authoritarian regime. It spoke for a profoundly socially conservative and pious constituency which was located upon the contested geographical periphery of Britain. Its upper echelons were staffed by socially and culturally elite men. So on the face of it, this is an unlikely home for a campaigning liberal and for such a person to have emerged from. In the late 1950s, Hyde's persistent efforts in the House of Commons to secure the decriminalisation of male homosexuality resulted in him being deselected as an MP in North Belfast. And although he was freed from having to return to and live in Belfast, I think much to his relief, he was subsequently obliged to lean on his pen to earn a living. By the time of his death in 1989, Harford Montgomery Hyde was the author of a remarkable 53 books on subjects ranging from espionage to crime and punishment to political biography. Perhaps his most famous work, which we're going to discuss briefly, The Other Love, was an early historical contemporary study of homosexuality. So the question you may be wondering about this, was Hyde gay? I mean, everyone would ask that. Perhaps surprisingly, the answer is no. He was avowedly heterosexual. He was married 3 times, but in today's language, he would be termed an ally. For Jeff Dudgeon, his biographer, Hyde was rather than being an aberration, he was a recognizably progressive yet traditional British politician who combined establishment and conservative associations with socially liberal tendencies. So there's one element of Hyde's biography that Jeff Dudgeon didn't really talk about, which was that Montgomery Hyde was a humanist. So, Hyde was born in Belfast in 1907. His background was that of the Belfast mercantile elite. His father was a linen merchant and a unionist councillor. His mother's family was said to be more liberal, but they had been involved in the 1948 UVF gun running. So he attended private school. He progressed to private school in England. He returned to attend Queen's University Belfast, that fine institution, and then went to Magdalen College, Oxford. So far, this is quite conventional for being someone who's going to train to be a barrister who comes from this socially elite background. However, at Oxford, he moved in advanced and bohemian circles. He inhabited a suite of rooms that once lived in by Oscar Wilde, where he hosted a poetry reading by the flamboyant and fabulously wealthy homosexual Evan Morgan, later Viscount Tredegar. Dudgeon notes that from surviving correspondence of his time at university, he tells of a modern outlook which included a burgeoning interest in sex. Hyde's incomplete and unpublished autobiography makes clear that during this period of his life, he questioned and came to reject religious orthodoxy. This process was not unrelated to his falling in love with a young Catholic woman, during which time he flirted with Catholicism, feeling attracted by its theatricality. But he came to reject religions and supernaturalist claims in their entirety. So the biography tells how this happened. So I won't read all of this because it's a bit much. So the process by which I became an agnostic or humanist, as I prefer to call myself, was gradual. So he was stimulated by the writings of Victorian skeptics, and here we see a frontispiece of Lecky's Rationalism in Europe, which appeared in 1865, and he talks about how he found a copy of Lecky's book in Smithfield Market in Belfast. He said, "More than anything else, these books convinced me of the fallacies of revealed religion." So Hyde continued by asserting that he failed to see how any rational person could, quote, honestly believe in the story of the Garden of Eden or that the world was created in 6 days. Consequently, I have refused to take the oath on the Bible when giving evidence in a court of law because I cannot bring myself to believe it is divinely inspired. When an MP, Hyde affirmed. Funnily enough, he said, one of the heresies laid to my charge when I was disowned in North Belfast, this was one that somehow escaped the notice of my more bigoted critics. So, the historian Callum Brown investigated the loss of religion in individuals from across the Western world since the 1940s in his book, Becoming Atheist. Surveying a sprawling mass of oral history, some of which was transcribed by me, Brown concluded that narratives were profoundly gendered, with those created by men emphasizing the power of reason and intellect within their journeys from faith. Although of an earlier generation, Montgomery Hyde's account of becoming humanist fits neatly within this paradigm. Secondly, Hyde's flirtation with Catholicism prior to becoming humanist neatly demonstrates 2 rival trajectories available to those who sought alternative life stances in the early 20th century. And interestingly, in the early 20th century, Catholicism enjoyed a level of popularity amongst elite and artistic homosexual men in Ireland and England, which now seems a little baffling, and speaks of a distant and antiquated cultural world. For example, Hyde's contemporary and Belfast native film director Brian Desmond Hurst adopted Catholicism as part of an ambitious program of self-reconstruction in the 1920s. However, Montgomery Hyde clearly found the existential claims made by churches impossible to accept. Furthermore, he makes clear in his memoir that, prompted by his reading, he came to believe that political authorities were attached to religion due to political cynicism and expediency. Hyde professed himself struck by the, quote, anti-Christian chapters in 18th century historian Edward Gibbon's famous doorstopper, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He was especially taken with Gibbon's observation that all religions are to the believer equally true, to the philosopher equally false, and to the magistrate, i.e. the politician, equally useful. Social conditions in Belfast would have provided ample material which to confirm this viewpoint. So, however, unlike some other Irish Protestants who lost religious faith during this time, Hyde did not reject his political along with his religious background. And I would argue this is due to his social class and access to elite networks, which meant that he would have had expectations of prestigious employment, which may have been jeopardized. His unique background resulted in him becoming an almost extraordinary figure for his times, a socially liberal and secular Ulster Unionist. So in the 1930s, Hyde worked as a barrister in London while developing his craft as a writer and researcher, and later in military espionage during the Second World War. And this explains his fascination with these topics. He kept a personal scrapbook during this time, which is preserved in the Public Record Office down the road, and while not hugely relevant, I thought you might like to see some bits of it. So here we have young Montgomery Hyde. It's quite a vain man to collect your own press cuttings like this. Here we go. There's one who's having a lecture, is having a change of topic. Even quite early on, he was fascinated by these kind of unsolved Irish mysteries. And here's very much, and this is profile pic material, as they'd say, this is his military intelligence identification card. And here he is, interestingly, I hadn't even noticed this before, he had a book on Oscar Wilde coming out at the same time he was about to be nominated as a Unionist MP. So already very interesting. So Hyde was elected MP for North Belfast in 1950, and a Dudgeon admits that he regarded his seat as a prize to be won. He took Edward Gibbon's advice to heart and went through the motions of cultural and religious conformity to obtain a seat at Westminster, making speeches to his Protestant electorate which referenced Christianity, and he joined the Orange Order. So I've talked about loss of religion and renegotiating identity in the heady days of the 1920s. I mean, Jeff's biography makes clear that Montgomery Hyde was not a believer, but he didn't pursue the implications of this beyond the possibility that they freed Hyde from, quote, many related conformities. So I'm going to argue here that Hyde's humanism was much more important to his preoccupation with liberalizing social reform than has been given credit. And also, if we focus entirely on losing religion, we are in danger of seeing becoming humanist in overly negative rather than positive terms, a process of losing rather than gaining. And I think that humanism can explain why Montgomery Hyde took up the deeply unpopular and perilous cause of homosexual law reform in the 1950s. So, a quote for you here. "Human responsibility is the nuclear idea in the definition of humanism." So I'm paraphrasing, he wasn't terribly mid-20th century liberal philosopher and humanist leader Harold Blackham. Rather than an existence being directed by mysterious and unknowable social supernatural forces, humanism emphasizes individual moral responsibility. Furthermore, the well-known 1996 IHU minimum definition of humanism, which drew upon a century or more of earlier thought, emphasizes that humanism, quote, stands for the building of a more humane society through an ethics based upon human and natural values. So contrary to this, Britain's punitive laws against male homosexuality were, prior to 1967's partial decriminalisation, derived from Christian moral thought and ultimately appealed to religious authority. Consequently, Montgomery Hyde's advocacy of homosexual law reform in Parliament in the 1950s was motivated by more than his personal sympathy with homosexuals and fascination with sexualities. His actions were grounded in his humanist ethics and impelled by his sense of moral responsibility. So, you'll be glad to hear, towards the end, Hyde's celebrated 1970 book, The Other Love, was published not long after the 1967 Act, and it provided a history of the persecution of homosexuals in the past and a survey of the, quote, contemporary scene. In the latter, Hyde was assisted by the Homosexual Law Reform Society and the Albany Trust, who provided case histories. Hyde corresponded with various personalities who'd been directly involved with reform, including Sir John Wolfenden. It was one of the earliest LGBT histories published in Britain, and while it is an effective time capsule of liberal discourses from the period, it remains readable and compelling today. So finally, I'm going to show briefly how the narrative of The Other Love was informed by humanist concerns. It was obviously a campaigning book which exposed the cruelty and excesses which characterised the legal persecution of gay men in British and Irish history. In true Hyde style, the bulk of the narrative was comprised of chronologically organised analysis of spicy and often gruesome British and Irish sex scandals from the early modern period to the mid-20th century. Presenting himself as a dispassionate observer, which he was not, Hyde argued for greater humanity and rationalism in policing sexualities. Contrary to this, legal discrimination and persecution was rightly seen as irrational. Hyde observed that in the rest of Britain, the legislative change has been generally accepted, at least amongst rational and liberal-minded thinkers. Notably, although he analysed the scriptural origins of homophobia, Montgomery Hyde generally refrained from explicit attacks on Christianity. However, it would be difficult to read the text without reaching the conclusion that he was unimpressed by theological claims to divinely sanctioned moral authority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. We don't have much time left. Will we throw it up to the audience, or do you want to talk at first? Do you want to have a quick chat? Do you want?
Oh, I don't know. I'm recovering.
We were recovering. Are you all right?
Oh, right. We had some technical problems.
Could I just ask about Montgomery Hyde, who I vaguely know from, he did a biography of Carson and things like that. Did he get much opposition? He's standing in Parliament. He's in favour of the Wolfenden report. He's standing in Parliament as an Ulster Unionist, saying Wolfenden should be implemented. And Wolfenden was how many years before the '67 decriminalisation?
10.
At least 10 years. So he's in the 50s. What were the other Unionists thinking of him? Were they going? Was there no sanction on him? Was there no?
No, I mean, I don't think they would not have been impressed by it, and neither would his colleagues on that side of the House have been impressed by it. But I think that he was, to some extent, protected by his status as a kind of intellectual gent. The upper echelons of this party would have been a very sort of genteel world and club-like sort of world. So I think and I think maybe he overthought how much that would protect him, and in the end, the local constituency association deselected him. But I mean, he didn't secure it in Parliament. He argued in vain. He was not successful.
Yeah.
He was researching the book when it was successful through a different campaign by other people who were still in Parliament, and he spoke to them and he put their voices into the narrative.
Can I ask then about things like the Belfast Ethical Society? And some people might say, look, that was only just a few weirdos having a meeting in a pub. You know, it really didn't have any influence at all, did it? I mean, is there anything tangible we can say these people created something that was outside the political norm in Ireland?
Well, they were certainly, as I say, they were very much seen as actually taking over at the time from the Independent Labour Party in Belfast, which, as far as I understand it, kind of the existing group failed in 1897, and so they took over. They kind of occupied that position, and they were then seen as providing, as much as anything else, a forum for those progressive ideas and for those viewpoints and individuals to be brought together. And so they were, as I say, providing a discussion space, a community as well, which we can often forget.
I was saying earlier, I mean, even today, you know, a lot of people might be reluctant to come out, but it was quite a brave thing to do then, was it, in those times, to come out and say, listen, I don't believe in a God, are you mad?
Yeah, definitely. And they do talk, again, it's been joked about a few times over the course of the convention so far, but there was this idea still of kind of, well, are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? Yeah. And there was still this, sense of that being very tied in. But it was a brave thing, and like I say, it's notable and interesting and valuable that we can see that they self-identified as rationalist, that they self-described as agnostic, that they were listing that on the census, that Knox described himself as having no religion, and his wife and child were described as having no religion on the census too.
Which is quite brave, yeah.
Yeah, it was brave, and you do wonder. I mean, it's hard to know because we don't have or not that I've managed to find anyway. That I can't find a Knox archive or a Gilliland archive, but reading, I suppose, between the lines of those things, you do wonder whether there was a kind of kick back to that. But they were providing an important
Well,
space.
it's nice to know, it's comforting to know that there were people like that, because they were always very binary, as you say, and the religion can be quite oppressive here, and it's nice to know that there were people who were prepared to stand up and say, no, we don't believe. Anybody got any questions for us? Anybody like to ask anything of our... Yes, gentleman on the front row there.
Hi, Madeleine. A comment for you, really. You said that the ethical societies emerged in the 1880s, which sounds like it was a kind of spontaneous process. I'm just thinking, isn't it worth acknowledging the fact that the ethical movement was started by an American Jew by the name of Felix Adler? I don't know if you want to just say a little bit about him.
Yeah, I would
just to
love
give, Just to give him an acknowledgement.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really important to note. So I didn't say it, and one of the reasons was I'm always worried that I'm drastically repeating myself in these things, because I'm not sure who's come to things I've spoken at before. But the ethical movement began with the ethical culture movement, which was started in America by Felix Adler, the son of a rabbi, in 1876 with the New York Society for Ethical Culture. And this was founded with the motto, deed, not creed. So it was about doing things, coming together to live good lives without needing to, like the ethical societies took up, to agree on supernatural ideas, on ideas of theology, rooted in that idea of self-reliance, of self-determination, and of morality being fundamentally separate to religion. And Stanton Coit, who I mentioned, was directly influenced by Felix Adler in the US. And he, in fact, was a member of that society and very much helped to bring it over.
See, you try to catch her up. She knows her stuff, don't you? Is there any other questions? Anybody like to say, gentleman there? Anybody?
No, it was.
Come to you in a second.
Yeah, it was just really. I've been working a bit with Maddie on the history, and one of the interesting aspects, I think you mentioned, Tim, the courage of individuals, and I think we have managed to trace the connections, the personal connections between people. Really over the generations, and it's only been a few people really from the sort of 1890s right through to the 1960s, 70s, even to today, really, where the humanist light in the window, if you like, has been kept alive over that time, and now we're able to build on that. But I think it just shows the importance of individuals and tracing the history through individuals rather than thinking of it really as some sort of grand movement.
Yeah,
you know,
agree with that entirely. In fact, the next session will be with Laura LaCall and Eugene McMullen, who are two people who took the case here for humanist weddings. Very pioneering case. I don't think you have it in England, so you don't have humanist weddings. I see, no, we're ahead of you for once.
Yeah.
Lady in the front row, you wanted to ask a question?
I just wonder whether the term internationalism comes into humanism, and whether the North Ireland humanists have contacts with humanists all over the world.
Yes. So certainly I would say, from looking at the history as well, that internationalism has always been a part of the movement. So not just between the various British Isles, but also the wider world and the international movement. Today, that's best seen in Humanists International, of course, and the work that they do to bring the global humanist movement together and global address global challenges for humanists and non-religious people in different countries. But it was very much part of the vision kind of from the beginning. So, for example, the year that the Union of Ethical Societies was formed, there was also an international conference which was held in Zurich that year, which brought together representatives from Europe and America. So not fully international, has to be said, but they were certainly drawing inspiration and working together. They saw it as something that was much much wider than that.
Thank you very much. Can we have one last question, because we're just running out of time and I don't want to be late for the next session or keep them back. Yes, in front.
Just to mention that, for the lady asking about the International Federation, she should have been in Glasgow 3 weeks ago this weekend. They came from all over the world for the World International Humanist Congregation, and we gave them a burn supper and a ceilidh, and they're still trying to recover.
Yeah.
Well,
and I do just think it's worth mentioning as well, when we're talking about that international element, that it can be tempting, and I think in histories looking back, and sometimes we think about it too much as though humanism is this white Western tradition, and it isn't. It's much more global than that. It's much more diverse. There's been humanist ideas and ideals present across the world in all cultures, as long as human beings have been thinking about what it means to be alive and to live with each other. So not just, I mean, obviously we've been thinking today about Northern Ireland specifically, but it's always important to remember that, I was about to say no man is an island, but it's important to remember that there is this much wider and much longer and much more diverse history, which is certainly at the heart of Humanists International today, and indeed Humanists UK and Northern Ireland Humanists, but is historically true and has
we have a
always been
bad
true.
tendency here to think we are the centre of the universe and everything is about us, but it is a far, far wider issue. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your attention. As I say, I don't want to hold up the next conference, which is, I think it's up the stairs, but will you please give a massive round of applause to Madeleine Goodall and Charlie Lynch. Thank you very much for your attention. See you later on. Thank you.